Before jumping into Aristotle, I wanted to do an overview of some of the themes that we found in Plato, in the passage from the Republic that we read, and in the Gorgias. So, if you recall, at the beginning of class, the beginning of the course, when I was talking about philosophy and what we're going to be doing in the class, I highlighted three kind of sub disciplines of philosophy or subjects of philosophy: metaphysics, epistemology, and ethics. So, what I want to do right now is just kind of go through what we'd read from Plato, highlighting his metaphysical, epistemological, and ethical ideas. And then the idea is going to be that, we'll see. Aristotle's going to develop certain of these ideas from Plato. He's going to disagree with others. So when we were looking at Plato, in the Republic in particular, we saw him put forward or assume this theory of the forms, which we talked about in detail. And this theory of the forms involved this distinction that Plato draws between an intelligible world that we access with our minds and the sensible world, which we access with our senses. And Plato gives an account of how those two worlds relate to each other. He gives an account of that when he talks about participation. In Plato's view, the various things down here in the sensible world participate in the various things up there in the intelligible world. So the tree outside of your window participates in the form of tree. That's what makes the tree outside of your window a tree. It's the very fact that it participates in the form of tree. And so, what Plato is really giving us with his theory of forms is an account of the structure of reality. Reality at its most fundamental and basic. This is how reality is structured. This is how things are. So forms, participation, these are the fundamental ideas when you're trying to think through the ultimate structure of reality. That's metaphysics. Plato also hints at the soul. This is clear in the Gorgias. He talks about the soul. This is clear in the Republic. He talks about turning the soul. In the Gorgias, he talks about the virtues as being virtues of the soul. He talks about human beings having these two aspects, body and soul. But he never really goes into much detail about it. And really, he never goes into much detail about participation or laying out this theory of the forms in any kind of precise detail. He hints at this theory of the forms, he hints at the soul, but he doesn't really explicate them at length. One of the things that we're going to see in Aristotle is that he's going to take up these ideas and explicate them at length. He has a whole treatise on the soul, and we're going to read some from it. It's called the De Anima. He takes up the idea of form. He gives a very different account of it than Plato gives, but he takes up this idea of form as being essential to the fundamental structure of reality. And Aristotle gives an account of it, a much more precise, detailed account of how form shows up in this sensible world. A much more detailed account of the fundamental structure of reality. So what we're going to see is that Aristotle is going to pick up on these kind of suggestions or hints from Plato and then develop them in great sophistication and detail. Epistemologically, Plato gives us an account of what knowledge is. Knowledge in the fullest sense, consists in the grasping of these forms. Little old me, I don't really have knowledge of trees. I mean, I know that that's a tree outside my window or whatever, but I don't really have knowledge of trees because I don't really grasp the form of trees. To have knowledge of trees is to know their essential nature, to know what makes a tree, to know the essence of treeness. And that's something that a botanist has, someone who's done their PhD in tree science or whatever it might be, right? They, Plato would say, grasp the form of tree. That's really what knowledge is. Moreover, so that's part of Plato's theory of the forms. Moreover, Plato is quite clear that knowledge, or at least certain kinds of knowledge, are very important for living well. This is the upshot of the image of the cave. To live well, one must pursue knowledge. And in particular, one must be oriented towards the truth. And so what we find in Plato is truth as the highest value, truth as what ultimately matters. And the mark of a life well lived is a direction toward truth. Again, we're going to see Aristotle pick up on some of these ideas, develop them in his own way. The importance of knowledge and truth for living well. Aristotle's going to go on in greater detail than Plato does. Knowledge as consisting in grasping of form. Aristotle's going to develop this idea. Lastly, we saw Plato's kind of talking about ethics, and we already started kind of getting into this with epistemology. According to Plato, virtue is necessary for a good life, and Plato's got this idea that virtue and knowledge are somehow bound up together. And so, yes, knowledge is important for living well, but so is virtue, and there's some sort of relationship between knowledge, truth, and virtue. Again, Aristotle's going to take up this idea and run with it, develop it in his own way. But one of the things that I want you to see, and one of the reasons I want to lay this out in the way that I have right now, is that all of these different views, Plato's metaphysical views, his epistemological views, his ethical views, are interrelated. They all dovetail with one another. Right? Just look at, the theory of the forms in metaphysics. Well, that's related to his epistemological views because he thinks of knowledge as consisting in the grasping of forms. And that's also going to be related to his view of what a good life consists in, because a good life consists in kind of communing with these forms, with having this knowledge of them and so on, right? And so it's not as though Plato just puts forward one theory and, puts it forward for our consideration and accept it or leave it, one isolated theory. Plato, his philosophy suggests that it's a kind of package deal. All of these views kind of hang together. And that what philosophy then is giving us are these kind of systematic views, these systematic perspectives, ways of approaching the world. And Plato gives us one, and we're going to see one from Aristotle. Now, before jumping into Aristotle's own works, just a quick biographical sketch of who he was. So he was born in 384 and dies in 322. That makes him 40 years younger than Plato. So he's of the next generation. He was not born in Athens. He was born in a city-state called Stagira, which was part of Macedon, which was a kingdom to the north of the Greek city-states, modern-day Macedonia, if you know that area of Europe. He, however, at a young age, I think people think 17 or 18, travels to Athens and takes up residence at Plato's academy. So Plato had started this school instead of going into politics, which is what his family would have expected him to do. Plato instead started what was essentially the first institution of higher education called the academy. And Aristotle was the most famous student of this academy. And so he joins in 366 BC, and he stays for around 20 years. He stays until Plato's death. So Plato dies in 347 BC. And after that time, Aristotle kind of travels the Greek world, he goes back to Macedon and becomes a tutor to Alexander the Great. So Alexander the Great was Macedonian. It's thought that Aristotle's father had connections to the royal court of Macedon, that Aristotle's father may have been the doctor to the king, the personal physician to the king of Macedon, Philip II. Philip II's son was Alexander the Great, and so Aristotle had connections to the Macedon court, and so he is tapped to be Alexander the Great's tutor. Eventually, if you know something about world history, right? Alexander the Great kind of takes over, conquers the entire Greek world and more besides, and that includes Athens. And so Alexander the Great takes over Athens. Aristotle comes back into Athens, starts his own school at this place called the Lyceum. And so starts a kind of a school outside the academy. He's not a part of the academy anymore. He starts his own school, of which he is the head, at the Lyceum. They found the ruins of this school maybe 20 so years ago, and now it's a museum. They were trying to build a parking lot, and they started digging down, and we found Aristotle's school. And so I think you can go visit it now. You probably have to pay an arm and a leg, but there it is. It's there. You can go find it. Much like Plato, Aristotle has an influence on subsequent culture that is hard to overstate. Aristotle really sets the agenda for all learning, investigation, science, philosophy, even theology for hundreds and hundreds of years. Incredibly influential. Indeed, Aristotle is often credited with starting a number of disciplines. So obviously, as I've already kind of indicated, he's picking up on things that Plato had initially started. But Aristotle is by and large credited as the first biologist. He started the field of biology. Perhaps in certain ways, the first psychologist, not really in the sense that we think about it, but the first person to really delve into the nature of the mind and how the mind works. Although you do find some of this in Plato. The first, one of the first people to really push the study of the natural world. And so really, in some sense, a founder of kind of all of the natural sciences. And we're going to see how this works as we jump into this first reading from his called The Physics, because what Aristotle is going to be doing in this reading is showing us how knowledge of the natural world is possible and what it consists in.